Okay, so good morning, everybody, and welcome to another session of our investment banking course. As I anticipated you in the previous session, I have the honor and pleasure to host today a good friend of mine and also a former student of mine, Mr. Alessandro Luongo. Alessandro is a long-dated friend because he was a student at Bocconi some years ago. And after he left Bocconi, he went through a brilliant career before as an investment banker in Merrill Lynch, and then in private equity investment. He spent quite a long period of time in between New York and London in Towerbrook Capital, and then he became partner in Invest Industrial, which is an industrial holding that is investing in pan-European investments. And more recently, he became managing director at Alvarez & Marsal Capital, which is the institution where currently Alessandro is employed. I have invited Alessandro because during this part of the course, we are focusing on replacement capital, leverage buyouts, and private equity for not young firms. And experience that can be brought to the class by Alessandro is definitely very valuable in order to bring a fresh life and practice to what we have already discussed into our course. From this point of view, I first of all thanks Alessandro for being with us today. Again, a real pleasure and honor, Alessandro, to have you on board again in this course, although in a different format than the usual one you are familiar with. And I say simply that I will monitor the chat box so that if questions arise from the audience, I will take the liberty to stop you, Alessandro, and ask you the question coming from the students. And I encourage, indeed, the students to submit questions because, as always, Mr. Luongo is more than pleased to address any kind of question coming from the audiences. So, again, I don't want to steal precious time for the presentation. I thank again Alessandro Luongo for being with us today. Alessandro, stage is yours. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stefano. First of all, can you hear me okay? If anyone has any issues, please raise it and we'll address it. So thank you for the intro, Stefano. It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here virtually. I wish we could be in person. It's much more pleasant when I can see all of your faces and walk in the classroom I used to be in. So hopefully we can get back to that soon. But thank you for making the time early this morning, even though you're compelled. But let me, if you agree, what I wanted to do is first give you a brief intro of my career, my background. Less because I want to reminisce how long it's been, but more because I want to understand perhaps my path, how I got where I am, in case it's relevant for any of you. And then we'll go into a little bit how my current firm operates and our strategy, the type of deals we look at, how it differs perhaps from other firms I've worked with or come across. And then lastly, we'll go through a couple of case studies of current investment, so we can give you a bit of a practical sense of what we do. As Stefano said, along the way, please stop. Please write questions so we can make it more interactive. So it's not just me going on a monologue, but would love to make it interactive as much as possible. So perhaps let me start with my background. So I was born in Italy, raised between Italy and the UK. I was interested in finance because my father was doing M&A for an Italian tech company called Olivetti, and through that I got a little bit of the experience of what it meant to look at companies, travel, negotiate deals, understand acquisitions, and it seemed interesting. So as I explored that, I decided to go into finance, and that's what I studied at Bocconi. Graduated in 2004 with my bachelor's in finance, what was then called CLEFIN, and that gave me a taste of what investing meant, and frankly, I was itching to get into work. So after 3 years, I decided not to do a master right away, and I jumped into work. I was fortunate enough to go into investment banking. It was very competitive. I'm sure it still is, but I was fortunate to get 3 offers: one from Goldman Sachs, one from Credit Suisse, and one from Merrill Lynch, all in London. I would have loved to go to New York because that was always my dream, but I didn't have a visa. I didn't get organized enough. So I ended up going to London. I chose Merrill Lynch because of the people, frankly. They were all very good firms. And I was doing M&A at Merrill Lynch for 2 years in London, but covering pan-European deals, everything from large industrial mergers to carve-outs to IPOs, as well as private equity backed investments. And that's where I got a sense of private equity, how they work. So I worked on buy-side advisory roles with Blackstone, with Bain Capital, with Apax, and it gave me a feel of what it's like to be a private equity investor. So when 2 years later, in 2006, I got a call from a headhunter about exploring private equity, I was very interested. So I explored different firms, from large cap, Blackstone again, to sort of more unusual, very flexible, like Oaktree, to where I ended up, which was as a firm called TowerBrook. The interesting part about TowerBrook was that it was originally the private equity arm of Soros Fund Management. So George Soros, you may know, the hedge fund billionaire, very talented investor who's now in his 80s and on his third wife, was a very successful investor, and he had a private equity arm. And this group spun out and started their own firm independently of Soros, and that was what was TowerBrook at the time. So I spent 11 years at TowerBrook, more or less half in London and then half in New York. So I was able to get to where I ultimately wanted to. And then after that, I moved, as Stefano said, to Invest Industrial, which started as a family office industrial holding group, and then over time morphed into a more institutional private equity firm. And I spent 3.5 years there, based in the Lugano office, not far from Milan, covering all of Southern Europe. And then about a few months ago, I decided to join a smaller firm to be able to help build it from the early days, have a bigger role, and come back to London. So that's where I am today. I'm calling from London, and the firm is called Alvarez & Marsal Capital, which I'll tell you about. Perhaps just to point out, before we get into that, what I liked, what I've been fortunate enough to have so far in the last 15 years in private equity has been to see the variety of different investment styles and methods. What I mean by that is I went from, I would say, a mostly value-oriented firm like TowerBrook, where think of buying a business for more than 8 times EBITDA was a stretch, to a place like Invest Industrial, where the industrial logic, the love of a brand was much more important. So, we'd pay 14, 15 times EBITDA for a business if we really loved it. So, to give you an example, at Invest Industrial, they loved consumer brands, very well-known brands that were often very expensive. So think of Aston Martin, Sergio Rossi for the ladies in the audience. Design furniture companies like B&B, Floss, Lewis Paulson, and Knoll, to give you a sense of the things they liked. So that was, it's more growth, higher price investments. And now I've joined a firm which is sort of both. So we're flexible, and I like that, because if it's something where we think we need to buy it at a low price and then do a lot of work on it, we will do that. But at the same time, if it's something that's very exciting, fast growing, where you need to pay up for it, we are willing to do that as well. So that's, I think it's been interesting, and we're happy to talk more about it if any of you are interested. The different styles, because every firm is a bit different. I've had the fortune of working in different continents, in Europe and North America primarily, investing anywhere from Italy, Spain, to Scandinavia, to Poland, and then in the US, anywhere between California, Texas, the East Coast. So that's been very good, as well as all kinds of sectors. So anywhere from healthcare, blood testing, to luxury women's shoes, to cinemas, the whole spectrum. So feel free to ask me what comes to mind, and I will try and answer. Perhaps let me pause there for a second and get a sense. I see there are about 48 of you in the audience. Maybe in the chat, how many of you are interested or would like to explore potentially a career in private equity? If you're interested, put it in the chat, so we just get a bit of a sense of how many of you.
If you are interested, guys, you can simply say yes by putting yes in the chat box, so to give a sense of how many of you could be interested in pursuing a career in private equity. Very good.
Very good. So this works. Some kind of interaction. Thank you, guys. So that's very interesting, and obviously, if you want to explore, I think part of this, the goal of this session is also to understand how you can get into it, what it means, how it compares to investment banking, for example, which is also a great profession, but often a stepping stone into private equity, for example. Maybe unless there are any specific questions on my experience so far, and we can always come back to it. We'll leave some time at the end as well. I would.
Alessandro, sorry to interrupt you. Just a question that could be useful also for all the students that have said yes. In general, when you talk about careers in private equity, typically you are said that there are basically three possible entryways. The first one is from consulting, the second one is from investment banking, and the third one is, if you have a chance to do so, to enter in the sector as an intern, with an internship as an internee, and then grow inside the sector. How much you see them still valid nowadays, and among the three, which is, in your opinion, the most successful or the most useful to get success inside the world of private equity?
Yep. I would also add one more. That's a good question, Stefano. I would also add one more, which is also a little less usual, but it's from a career in management, where you can enter more on the operating side typically. But I would say the most traditional and most common is through investment banking. So typically Most people who work in private equity will have spent 2-3 years in banking, and then will join a private equity firm. I would say maybe that's 70%, 60-70% of candidates. I would say another maybe 20-30% is from consulting, and then the small percentage that's left range between, call it, say 10% or so from go directly into the industry after school, or come from management. That's, I would say, directionally how I've seen it. And really the reason for that is that investment banking we see it as a very good training ground. So it's like effectively like the military of finance, because you learn the basics, you spend all-nighters, and I can tell you about those. It's like in the movies. You do spend all-nighters and work super hard, but you learn really how to master Excel, PowerPoint, the valuation methods, and it's important for private equity because we don't have the time, or we're lazy. We don't want to train people on that. We'll train them on other things, but the basics need to be very well understood. So what I always tell people when they ask me about joining the industry from, say, consulting or directly from school or other, I say the key thing is to really master the financial modeling, because that is key, right? That every private equity firm will want you to know that and not have to teach you that. So if you don't have the investment banking training, let's say, it's important that you spend time, doing your homework and practicing that on your own, doing a course, whatever it is, but you really have to own that, because that's key. I mean, as an aside on investment banking, if I don't think Stefano will include it in the course, but I recommend a book called Monkey Business, which talks about the heydays of banking in the 80s and 90s. It's quite funny, and a fair amount of it's pretty true. So it's an amusing book. Does that answer your question, Stefano?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Alessandro.
All right. So we'll move on, and I'll share some slides, but not keep them on the whole time, so we can have more of a conversation. Let me pull it up. So let me tell you about the firm. So all right, so AM Capital is a global firm which was founded in the US over 10 years ago. We're a private equity firm, similar to others. We have 2.5 billion euros under management. European fund, which is where I am one of the 4 senior guys, is a 650 million fund. And we invest anywhere between 40 and 120 million per deal. Looking at companies, I would say mid-sized, that have an EBITDA of 15 to 50 million. Okay, so this is pretty standard. I think what is different is that we have a strategic affiliation with a consulting firm called Alvarez & Marsal. Now, you may or may not know it, but Alvarez & Marsal is one of the leading, if not the leading, operational consulting firms. So another example would be Alex Partners. So what that means is that, different from Bain, McKinsey, and Boston Consulting and the likes, Alvarez & Marsal is more focused on operations, i.e. most of their consultants are ex-managers, CEOs, CFOs, COOs, etc. which means they have real-world managerial experience versus strategic perspective. So what that means is that they're more involved in revenue enhancement, margin improvement, cost reductions, merger integrations, restructurings, etc. So they're more hands-on as consultants, right? And so this partnership with them allows us as a private equity firm to have access to their 5,000 people or so around the world whenever we look at a deal. So I'll give you an example. I get a teaser from a bank or an advisor that says, you know, this packaging company in Spain could be interested in selling a majority. Take a look. So I will look at it and share it with people within Alvarez & Marsal that know the sector, and they will give me an informed view of this company. So that's an advantage that most other firms don't have. For those of you that know the industry a little bit, it's a little bit like Bain Capital started in the 80s. So Bain Capital, one of the most successful and largest private equity firms in the world, started as a spin-off of Bain Consulting. So Mitt Romney, that you may know as a former presidential candidate of the Republican Party, was one of the founders of Bain Capital, and he was an ex-Bain consultant. And they had this very strategic relationship with Bain, which was a very strong advantage. And we're trying to replicate that, albeit in a slightly different way, to bring that expertise into investing. And we'll get into that, but really, private equity investing is, if you want to simplify it, it's finding good companies, paying a fair or a below fair price, trying to make them better by growing, by improving margins, by doing acquisitions, and then selling them after 3, 4, 5 years as a better, larger, more structured company. So that's really what we do. And having someone like Alvarez & Marsal alongside us is a very strong advantage. This I won't get into because it's very detailed. But in a nutshell, what we do is we look for companies that require some operational improvement. Again, so we can leverage the Alvarez & Marsal expertise. We focus our European fund, the one I'm in, focuses on businesses that are headquartered in Europe, but typically global, and we like to take them more global. The sectors we look at, we pretty much look at everything, but we have a preference for consumer. So one of our companies that I'll talk about is Bollé Eyewear, a French eyewear manufacturer. Some of you may know it. They have a couple of brands that are sunglasses or sports eyewear like ski goggles under the Bollé and Sebe brands. We are also interested in industrials, so machinery and so on, as well as services. And within that, it's broad, but particularly business services. And that's another company I'll tell you about called La Patria, which is an alarm monitoring business that we own in Italy. Size-wise, we talked about, we define it as mid-market, lower mid-market. So, 15 to 50 million of EBITDA, with revenues of, call it, anywhere between typically 50 to 200 million of revenues. And we typically take a control or majority position. Why is that? Well, because we want to have the ability to influence the direction of the business and the strategy in the company. Sometimes we will look at minorities, but that's not really in our sweet spot. Let me show you. Go back to the slides so that I can share a little bit about.
Alessandro, while you are showing the slide, I have a couple of questions for you that probably you will return on during the presentation. The first one is your preference toward majority. And so, as you said, you want to influence the strategic conduct of a firm, which, and this is my question, typically implies that you must, as an investor, have sort of, let me say, an industrial mindset, more than a pure financial mindset. And so the question comes out from this observation. You said that the big network of advisors and Marsal can help you, in a sense, capturing the industrial rationale of a particular investment. But you were born as essentially an investment banker, so a finance guy. How is it possible to get majority, to give a clear strategic direction to a company when you were born in finance? To put it differently, what I'm asking you is, in general, majority is linked to a team of partners that were born essentially with industrial experience, or is it still compatible to be a finance guy and take a majority and then impress a certain strategic direction to a firm?
That's a very good question, and worth discussing, because you are correct. It's a different evolution and skill set, and it's very important to keep that in mind. What I found is that you have to approach it with humility, because as an investor, you are not a manager. Most of us are not. Some are, and I'll show you some of the bios of my colleagues, and some have operational experience, but most of us are not. So you have to approach it with humility, because it doesn't work well when you, as especially a finance guy with maybe 10, 20 years younger than a CEO who's been in the industry 40 years, trying to tell them what to do. It usually doesn't go down well, and frankly, you shouldn't be doing that. What we do try and do as investors, at least the firms I've been at, and my personal inclination is to be more of a coach rather than a player. Right? The managers are the players. We can help coach them on general guidelines, best practices, because we've seen lots of different businesses over time, and the more you do it, the more patterns you see, and hopefully through that dialogue, and sometimes it's a bit of a clash with the management, you can get to a good result. So you'll push them to see things a bit differently based on other deals and investments you've made, and they will have their managerial industrial experience, which often is different. So I think you can evolve into it. Again, I think you have to know your limits. I've always enjoyed that, because I've always found it very interesting and a good. One of the reasons I love private equity is that it's not just investing and trading and speculating. It's you have to do something with it. Now, some firms are more active than others. The three I've been at, I think on the spectrum, are more active in the let's say in the value creation. Others are more passive, and it's fine too. They'll just buy, let the company do its thing, and then sell. That's fine too, but it's more like buying a stock in a public company. So what we do is we actually go, we help them, we look at the reporting and say, okay, how can you report better so that you can as a manager, make better decisions, right? If you can track weekly sales or daily margin, you can see which products are more profitable, which are selling and this week, and you can react quicker, you can ramp up production. Right? If you don't have the tools, it's hard to manage a business efficiently. So we often are able to bring better reporting, and that's really just because we've seen so many different kinds, and we can bring the best practices. We can help them do acquisitions, and that's a big part of our strategy. I will share some examples, but really many companies, especially in the mid-market, they don't know how to do acquisitions because it's complicated, and you have to go find the target, then you have to do due diligence, then you have to price it right, and then you have to integrate it. That's a complicated thing, which as a banker you'll learn a lot of it. A lot of that you'll learn, and then in private equity you should be used to doing that a lot. We can bring that, and we can help management make decisions. We can help them. We can help them with the integration. So that's, those are examples. I think we just try and bring the discipline, and we try and push management, because sometimes they get comfortable when a company's doing well. It's done well for a long time. They say, why change it? And I think that's fair. However, in a world like this where things are being disrupted continuously, and there's a good book about that, The Innovator's Dilemma, by Clayton Christensen, who's a Harvard professor. That's you have to keep evolving, you have to keep innovating, or at some point you could wake up and you have some disruptive companies that have taken your share. So that's what we try and do. We try and keep them on their toes, and there's criticism that private equity squeezes businesses, and in some cases it can be true. So it shouldn't be just for profit. It's really to help these businesses be best positioned, and frankly grow and hire more people. Obviously, we're not non-profits, but if we do a good job, the business we invest in is better positioned, more diversified, has a better management team, and is better set up for the future. So that's really what we aim for, and sometimes we succeed.
Excellent. Grazie, Alessandro.
Again, please remember to if you have any questions, to raise your hand or put it in the chat so we can address it. Let's go back to the screen. So going a little bit more into what we try and do, which is what we just touched on. We tend to look at markets not particularly unusual, but they're at least stable to growing. We don't like declining markets because that just is a huge headwind to deal with. Companies that are also in a decent position. We don't do restructurings. Some firms do. So think of Platinum or Cerberus. They are very good at restructurings and turnarounds. We do not do that. These are the types of deals primarily that we will invest in, family owned. These are usually very good starting points because often businesses outgrow their founders. What did I mean by that? They reach a size or a complexity that is hard for the original founder or family that owns it to manage. And therefore, someone that has dealt with bigger situations like us can be helpful in that transition. So often we will work with them and they will stay involved and reinvest, but they will admit their limits and we will help take the business to the next stage. PE owned is, this is the definition of replacement capital, where we're just replacing another private equity firm. But going back to the point about private equity firms being different, some are better at early stage companies, or they're better at growing product lines, and others are better at internationalization. So there are really different strategies and for different life cycles of a company. Carve-outs, where you buy a piece of a bigger business, and this is an example of Bollé that I was talking about earlier, and that I'll share more about. And builds, this really means you buy a company and then you add lots of other companies to it, creating synergies, creating scale. And this is frankly my favorite method, because I think you can create a lot of value through that. It's fun. You get to really know a sector, and then you're buying in a sector as if you were a strategic player, an industrial buyer. And we'll talk about the La Patria example. What do we do with them? We take them internationally. We continue to drive growth, organic and via acquisitions. We try and improve revenues and operations. What do I mean by that? Well, productivity, really. Using the same number of factories, the same number of people, can you drive higher revenues per individual, per product? And then operations, can you run more efficiently? So can you reduce costs? Can you leverage your resources better so you have higher margins and better cash flow? This is a little bit what we try and do with our businesses. This is a busy slide, so I won't go into it, but just to touch on it briefly, we already talked about our favorite sectors are these three. Business services, and you have examples here. So within that, you have anything from payment processing to the less sexy laundry and cleaning. And we have a few examples in the US and in Europe. Consumer and food, we like the more resilient parts of consumer and food. Obviously food, e-commerce, etc. We don't like, highly fashionable items, unlike some of my prior firms, because we think those are too volatile. Industrials, these are some examples. We don't like heavy machinery, so we prefer a bit lighter, where you have less capital expenditure, because then you're more control of your cash flow. And then these we will spend time on: healthcare, TMT, financial services, more opportunistically, because we have, as a group, not as deep of an experience.
Alessandro, sorry to interrupt you. Can you go back to the previous slide? Because I want to comment it. At the end of the day, if I look at the left-hand side, so the core focus, it seems to me that consumer and food, industrial, business services, they represent, let's say, sort of very stable, resilient to the recession kind of sectors. Is this essentially something that is close to the, let me say, value investing kind of approach? I ask you this because, as you can imagine, the disruption that we are living is probably putting at stake some of the well-known and established businesses. So my question for you is, you love, let me say, stable, recession-resilient kind of sectors, but when considering such kind of businesses, how is your approach in terms of the potential disruption that these businesses could face in the next few years, due to the fact that, of course, society will evolve and probably what we know today will not be there in the next, say, 10 years?
Yeah. So I would say we try to avoid businesses that we feel will be disrupted, have a high likelihood of disruption. So I'll give you an example. Traditional plastic packaging. There are a few companies still out there, and in some markets, believe it or not, these companies are still booming because the cost of using recycled plastics or alternative packaging is too high for the customers to be willing to pay that premium. But at least in our view, it's only a matter of time. So a business that fundamentally we believe will be disrupted, we will try to avoid. What we will try and do is focus, but that's what most people try and do, is focus on businesses that are already on the innovative side and can disrupt others, or at a minimum, businesses that are, say, more traditional, but that you can see are developing, are spending money on R&D. They are looking to develop that innovative side, right? So I'll give you an example. In the case of well, with the two companies we have in Europe, La Paz, the Italian alarm monitoring business, alarm monitoring can it be disrupted? I think there are evolutions. So, DIY alarms, things like that on the residential side. On the business side, i.e. alarm monitoring security for companies, we don't feel that there is a risk of imminent disruption. Now, what you can do is you can invest in higher technology services and solutions, which is what they're doing. For example, facial recognition, cyber security. And that's what we are pushing them to do, so that they keep, let's say, the traditional cameras and sensors and guards that will go and intervene if there is a breach or an alarm. But on top of it, we want to add these higher tech solutions. So that's how we see evolving the business, but also protecting it from disruption. On Bollé Brands, which is more, I would say, a more traditional business, and you can be disrupted, I think, from new brands, but also in terms of channel. And they, for example, they were getting a bit tired on the consumer side because they didn't have a proper e-commerce platform. So that really, we invested in that. That is not really innovative. We're just trying to bring it back to par, if you will. And I think there we will just need to keep evolving the business in terms to make sure it doesn't fall behind. But in the end, it's a pretty mature industry. I don't think sunglasses will go away. You have new players like Warby Parker and the likes who are lower cost, more sustainable. So you can go a bit more in that direction. But that, I feel, is pretty safe. Some other industries, I think we will entirely avoid.
Excellent. Grazie, Alessandro.
No worries. So I'll just switch to the next slide, and the goal of this is to show you the difference in profile, so that if you think of this career as some of you have mentioned, you get a sense of the backgrounds and what people look like. So I mean, first of all, I think the key takeaway here is to make sure you choose your picture wisely, because a lot of people will see it. So make sure you're happy with it. I think this is the senior team. We're a small team of 11 investors. These are the 4 senior guys. We talked about myself. Clearly, we need more diversity, because we just have 4 white dudes here. So we need to work on diversity, and the whole industry is trying. It doesn't help that it's you have to work really hard, and sometimes the demands on people are extremely high, and so often it's hard to reconcile that with a family. But putting that aside, I think we try and have a variety of nationalities, because we're covering all of Europe, and also investing styles. So to give an example, the founder, Mark, he's an Irish guy. He studied in Dublin and then Harvard. He was a manager, so he ran. He had senior roles in food service companies, i.e., food distribution businesses, as well as packaging. Smurfit Kappa is a packaging company. So he comes from an operating background. So he's been in the shoes of managers. So that helps a lot when we talk to entrepreneurs and managers, because he has managerial credibility. He also spent time at Bain, so he's been a consultant, and then he for the most part of his career he was at a very successful private equity firm called HIG, which is focused on value, I would say. So they're known for buying really, really cheap and doing that very well. Joachim, Norwegian, German, he speaks German as well, covers, we divide Europe amongst us, where Mark will cover UK, Benelux, Ireland, according to our nationalities. Joachim, who's a Norwegian German, he'll cover Scandinavia and the German-speaking region. He's an engineer by training, also went to Harvard, banking, and then spent a long time at a also very successful firm called BC Partners, which is, I would say on the spectrum, is a firm that pays high prices for high quality businesses. So, you know, you have Mark focused on value, you know, low prices, Joachim, high quality, high price businesses. Charles, who's French American, we actually worked together at Merrill Lynch, spent a long time at CCMP, which was JP Morgan Capital originally, so the private equity arm of JP Morgan. And he spent time really on the mid-market, and I think a pretty flexible firm, buying both value and high-priced businesses. And myself, I've talked about. So what we like about this combination is that we often have differing views, which is actually healthy. You want disagreement. You want a constructive dialogue, because if everyone thinks the same, I think you can make mistakes. So we try and challenge each other, where if I bring a deal, the others will say, well, what about this? Have you thought about that? Why do you like this part? The capital intensity is very high. How are you comfortable with that? It's healthy because it allows me and the others to try and avoid mistakes. The more different points of view, I think the better investor you can be. Just continuing on the team, again, this is the investment team, this is the sort of support team. The point here is just we have different nationalities. We try and cover all of Europe, and I think over the coming years, hopefully we'll keep investing well, and we will be looking to hire. So hopefully I'll come across some of you girls and boys in the future as we recruit. Oh, back to your question, actually, Stefano. I would say most of the people on this page come from a banking background, except for Mark, who's an operator, a manager, and then Thibault, who was at Roland Berger, as you see here, so from a consulting firm, whereas most people see banking. Your other question, I would say, if you look at this page, one of them, Jan, who's German, he started at directly in private equity. So I think he was an intern right out of school. Now that's possible. It's just less common. Now I'll pause for a second in case there are any questions so far, because the next step would be to go into some case studies and examples of our investments, but I want to pause for a second in case anyone has any questions.
Exactly.
So far.
Guys, the first part of the presentation, which is what the company is about, perspective of careers in private equity, has gone. So let's take a pause, and in case there is any particular curiosity that you have, since many of you has expressed an interest in getting a career in private equity, please feel free to either use your microphone or to submit questions so that we can turn them to the second part, which is an explanation with 2 case studies as to how Alvarez & Marsal Capital approaches companies. So feel free, if there is any question, to address it to our guest speaker. Don't be shy, of course. Alessandro is more than pleased to address any question you might have.
And while you do, since I've been...
It's a question coming from Lucas. Good morning, Lucas. Could it be badly perceived to change from one private equity fund to another one, as you will go with your network?
That's a very good question, Lucas. So I think it's both yes and no. So the way private equity incentives work is that you have long-term incentives. So if you think of public companies, you have stock options, right, that vest over time, and the whole point of that is to retain people. Private equity has a similar model, which is called carried interest, where you get cash compensation base plus bonus salary. Then you have a component which is called carried interest, and hedge funds have it too. That's a percentage of the profits. So you probably know this, but if we invest in a company, we invest 100 million, we double the investment, so we make 200 million, the gain is 100. Typically, carried interest is about 20%. So of the 100 gain, 20 will be shared by the investment team. So as a partner, as an employee in a firm, you get a slice of that, but it vests over time. So it vests typically over 5 years. So if you leave after a year, you'll only get 20% of that. So that's one way that you are retained. So because to your point, people want to retain people long term. The investment cycle is pretty long. It's not like day trading. So that is one aspect. And so careers tend to be, you tend to be in a place longer. So in my case, 11 years. The first time I wasn't planning to leave my second firm after 3.5 years, but I found a better opportunity and other things came up. So typically I would say, 5 years is in a place is more standard. The other aspect I would say, to your point, is yes, firms will want to retain you because they don't want your expertise and knowledge to leave. And frankly, you will have built this relationship with the CEO of a company you're responsible for, with the rest of the board, and it's hard to replace that, right? Because it's a very close relationship. So it's not ideal, but it happens. And to be honest, what you bring to a new firm is actually can be very valuable. So in both of my moves, I've noticed that I brought a different kind of network. As you point out, the network I brought at TowerBrook, which was both in Europe and in North America, was very valuable at Invest Industrial, which was more of a Southern European focused firm. So I brought several US relationships and Northern Europe relationships that many of my colleagues didn't have. So I think it was actually additive, as well as a different mindset. And I had invested in distressed debt when I was at TowerBrook, and I brought some different methodologies. Similarly, at my current firm, I went deeper in Spain and Italy in terms of relationships in the last 4 years, and I'm bringing those to A&M Capital. So from my standpoint and from the new PE fund that is hiring you, it's actually very additive. But to your point, that your current employer will try and disincentivize you through the carried interest, through non-competes. So non-competes are pretty common in the industry, especially as you get more senior. You will have, anywhere between 6 to 12 month non-compete, and they can be pretty stringent, where you are not allowed to start in another firm, or you will lose all your carry in the previous firm. So that was part of it. Frankly, it's something that you negotiate pretty hard, and I had to negotiate it pretty hard in my career moves. But it works okay, and the good news about it is you can enjoy 3 to 6 months of sabbatical in between, which is not common.
Excellent. Lucas, clarified your question?
I hope that answers your question, but
okay. Okay. Any other question for Mr. Luongo before moving to the second part of our presentation? Okay.
All right. Before I forget, for those of you who are interested, okay, there's another book.
A couple of questions for you, Alessandro. Leonardo and Oliver. Leonardo is asking you, regarding carried interest, based on your experience, it is paid more frequently on a deal or a fund basis? And what are the drivers that determine the modality of payment? And the second one is coming from Oliver. Good morning, Oliver. Which factors are the most important regarding the decision of focus on growth or value investing in a private equity firm? Is it about the set of skills that you have, expertise, something related to networks, or something else?
Both good questions, and clearly you've done some homework. But first, I was just saying, if you're interested in a book on private equity, there's a good one from the 80s which talks about one of the most famous and historical buyouts, perhaps one of the first, called Barbarians at the Gate, about the KKR, RJR Nabisco LBO of the 80s. So it's an interesting book. So on the first one, carried interest. So I would say it's usually based on a fund basis, i.e., you only get paid once the whole fund has returned its capital to its investors and has cleared the preferred hurdle, which is typically 8%. For those of you who don't know, you have to return. Let's say your investors commit $1 billion, you have to return $1 billion plus 8% on that billion for every year of the fund being open before any carry is distributed. So once you've cleared that 8% and you've just distributed it to your investors, most funds will then start to pay carry. On some occasions, I've seen a deal-by-deal carry, which was the case at some of TowerBrook's fund. I believe it was the case at, wasn't at Invest Industrial, but it is at A&M Capital Europe. Frankly, it's just a matter of negotiation. It's really, you negotiate with your investors, and obviously your track record helps a lot. To give you an example, we talked about Bain Capital before. They historically, I don't know if they still do, but they were able to charge a higher carried interest percentage just because they were outstanding. So if the industry was at 20%, they, for a long time, were able to charge 30% because they were just excellent and everyone wanted to invest in them. So it's really a negotiation, and I would say your best way of getting that is just your track record. I hope that answers your question. If you have any follow-ups, feel free to type it up. Going on to Oliver's. So I think the main driver is the senior team's experience, investing bias, and style. Typically, you coalesce with your partners when you're founding a firm around the specific strategy. You define it up front, and frankly, that is what you will position to your investors, right? So if you think about the investors in funds, they will typically have a portfolio, and similar to asset managers or diversified public investors, they will look for exposure to different geographies, sectors, macro trends. And the way they'll do that is they will look for a private equity firm. So just like as a public investor, you can look for an ETF focused on cryptocurrency or an ETF focused on natural resources or on China, you can do the same with private equity. So what I found particularly interesting is when you have a niche. So I'll give you an example. Invest Industrial was focused on Spain and Italy, and that's a niche. Now you have other players, but they were very good at that. You have people focused on the Nordics. You have people focused on healthcare. You have people focused on distressed, right? And the more specific you get, obviously, the more narrow your ability to move is. But the more specific you are, and the more investors can say, "Oh, these are the only guys doing that. I will invest in them." So I think you want to be specific, but not too specific, so that, you know, if you're in a cyclical sector, you're not forced to just do that. So, for example, I considered consumer-focused funds in the past, but I didn't want to be forced to invest in consumer businesses, you know, at any point in the cycle. I think you can make money. It's just very tricky, and I found it limiting. So hopefully that answers your question. I think it really is about the senior team, their bias, their knowledge, and their network.
Very good. Okay.
Fabulous.
Alessandro, what about to move to the second part of the presentation with a little bit of a sort of a focus on a couple of deals that show exactly a little bit of the philosophy that is behind the way you intervene with companies.
Absolutely. So I'll take you through to first Bolle Brands. Curious how many of you have come across Bolle Brands. The brands they own are Bolle, Cebe, C-E-B-E, H2 Optics, or Serengeti. If you've heard of these, please let me know, because I'm curious. This is basically a free customer survey, so put it in the chat if you will. Let me project it so you have a you had something to look at. Basically, this is an eyewear business, which is headquartered in France. It used to be part of a US diversified conglomerate that owned various sports brands and hunting gear called Vista Outdoor. So the reason we liked it was that it was a complicated deal. It was a carve-out, and we felt that through the carve-out and the complexity, you could buy a business at a good price that was complicated, and you could also, and there was a lot that you could do with this business. The interesting part about this, so these are the brands I mentioned that you may or may not know. The business is really two parts. It has a consumer brands part, which are these, and then an industrial safety part, so protective equipment. So think of the goggles you wear in a factory or at a hospital, and the two parts are very different. This one was frankly a bit tired. The brands were strong in the 90s, but have since been abandoned and so loss-making, whereas this one very profitable, because it was just a separate division managed well, that had been doing pretty well. So what we thought was, you can buy this for a good price. You have to do a lot of work because carve-outs are complicated. You know, you have to detach basically a limb of a business and set it up with its own IT systems, back office, renegotiate all the contracts they previously had as part of the broader group. So it's a lot of work, but you can create a lot of value through carve-outs, especially if they are abandoned or let's say disregarded within a bigger group. So I think that's a very interesting way to buy businesses, but you have to be willing to do a lot of work, and that's where we felt we could leverage the Alvarez & Marsal expertise in carve-outs, which they do all the time. So that gave us confidence that we could do that well. And then the idea was really to run these as separate businesses, because they are. Add or replace management, because they either were missing or had inadequate managers. Manage them better, and then sell them separately. So sell the industrial business separately and the consumer business separately, because they really don't belong together. No one even knows, whoever buys the sunglasses doesn't even know or care that they sell industrial protective equipment, right? So that's the idea. So far it's doing very well. We've been able to bring the consumer brands business almost to break even, which is not it's not easy. And the industrial safety business as you can imagine, with COVID, has been doing extremely well. So there we've had to invest to keep the production, to increase the production, to increase the shipping ability and the distribution, to be able, frankly, to fulfill the demand. So that's been doing very well. And that's sort of at a high level. What I would mention is, going to the next slide, is what we've been able to do for the consumer side is execute a very interesting acquisition, which is a company called SPY. If any of you have been to the States, you might have seen this. I don't think it's as popular in Europe. As you can see, most of the sales are in the US and Canada. It's a very complementary business in that they focus on sunglasses, snow goggles. This is prescription, motorcycle and action sports, and then other stuff. We felt it was very complementary with the Bolle brands, because SPY is focused on the US, Bolle is focused on Europe. SPY is more is focused on younger customers, younger, more action focused customers. Bolle is a bit older, so if SPY is under 30 on average years old, Bolle is 30 to 50. So serve different demographics, different geographies. They have a different brand DNA, and we felt SPY could leverage Bolle's distribution and presence in Europe, and vice versa. Bolle could benefit from SPY's US distribution, logistics, and overall presence. So and obviously there are best practices, right? So SPY has been very good with e-commerce, and so we took some of that knowledge to Bolle brands who didn't really have e-commerce, and so we saw it as very, very very strategic and a very good fit. On top of that, you also get some cost synergies, because you don't need 2 warehouses in the US. You can just use one. You don't need double back offices in the regions where they overlap. So that's an example of a strategic acquisition that is highly synergistic and diversifies your revenues, your end markets, your geographies, your product reach, and your customer base, and creates cost and operational synergies. Again, Alvarez & Marsal was very helpful in integrating these companies, because as you've probably studied and learned elsewhere, it's not easy to just put 2 companies together. The cultures are different, the mentalities are different, the way of working is different, the history, and maybe the geographic provenance is different. So it has to be managed delicately.
Alessandro, I have a question for you regarding this case. And the question is the following. If you go back to the previous slide, so slide number 9, when you introduced the origination of the deal, so essentially a company that operates 2 different businesses. One is industrial protection eyewear, and the second one is instead consumer. Isn't this first part of the story closer to, say, sort of a special situation? So you have a company that is not brilliant in terms of margin generation, and so at a certain point you decide to break up the company in 2 parts, which basically requires skills that are typical of a restructuring officer. So at the end of the day, you must understand exactly when the company gains money and when the company loses money, in order to avoid cross subsidization of the 2 businesses. While instead, the second part, the SPY Plus, is more closer if you want, to a more traditional kind of, let's say, build-up approach, typical of a private equity investor in the growth phase or in the development phase. So my question for you is, if I understand that this deal rationale, it's a mix of something like restructuring, first part, and then once you have carved out the business, the possibility to relaunch the business via sort of an acquisition process and a growth kind of pattern. Am I correct?
You're correct, Stefano. It's a very interesting case study because it covers very different investing styles, as you point out. It's a combination of, I wouldn't say distressed, I would say, yeah, opportunistic special situations because of the carve out, right? So you're buying in a carve out, it's complicated. And for example, TowerBrook did a lot of these. Then you bought a business that was really two parts, right? One that was growing, so the consumer business, the industrial business is healthy, has 20+% margins, it's cash generative, and it's growing. It was growing 10-15% top line. So healthy business, right? That was not a restructuring. And then you have the consumer business, loss making, tire brands. That is a restructuring. So you had these two different elements. And so yes, the strategies for these are different, right? So one is push growth and help actually enhance the growth and position them to be able to sustain that. And the other is really bring it back to break even, and then ideally create some growth. On top of that, as you said, once we felt that we had set up the business, we had carved it out. It was, by the way, carve-outs take 6 to 12 months. So with the first time post our ownership was really spent on making sure the business can stand on its own 2 feet, and that the carve-out was executed properly. Once we felt comfortable with that, we said, okay, let's now start looking for acquisitions. And that's how when we got into SPY. And then SPY is a combination of, yeah, it's both a growth play and a restructuring play, because I think it's a healthy business. The growth side, it amplifies your breadth, but it also gets you closer to break even because you have cost synergies, right? So you can leverage a bigger revenue base across the same back office overhead structure. So you're correct. It's a very interesting and varied case study. And frankly, we will sell them separately. We will sell the industrial business as a fast-growing, anti-cyclical business, because whether the economy is doing well or poorly, COVID or non-COVID, people always wear protective glasses. They always will in factories, in hospitals. It's key, and that'll be. We expect that to sell very well, very high price. Hopefully, if all goes well, we can make the whole return on our investment, i.e., 3-4 times, just from that side. And then on top of that, anything that we get for the consumer business, and we hope that we'll get something once we bring it back to break even. We don't expect a lot, but hopefully a buyer sees maybe a strategic, maybe a Safilo, a Luxottica. They will see it as a decent brand that is now profitable and that they can put in their stores across the world and push really hard and drive sales for with their marketing. Hopefully we'll get an okay price there, but if all goes well, and so far so good, that'll be on top of the already excellent return from the industrial side.
Excellent, Alessandro. Thanks very much.
Before I move to the other, any questions on this case study? Otherwise, I'll switch to La Patria, which is a different story. It's more of it's a buy and build. It's much more of a local business. It's smaller. And that really is buying a good, stable, anti-cyclical business, i.e., not exposed to recession really, but that just needed a bit of support on growth and on executing acquisitions. let me switch to that.
Any question before moving to the other case study? Well, Alessandro, let's move on. In the meanwhile, if there are questions, I will stop you and then I will tell you.
We can always cover them later as well. So the business, as I mentioned, is a mainly alarm monitoring. So what they will do is they will mainly work for corporate customers, so companies, stores, warehouses, etc., and provide alarm monitoring, as you see here, which is the vast part of the business. It's based in Emilia-Romagna, in Bologna. The way it works is it's a subscription model. So, you're a company, you have a company, you want to install an alarm system, you'll call them, they'll survey your place, they will give you they will set up cameras and sensors, and they will connect them to their central monitoring station. On top of that, they will have armed and unarmed guards that will both react to any breaches in the system. So if you have an alarm goes off at your company, there will be a few checks, and if it turns out to be a real alarm, they will send someone right away, a patrol. Also, in some cases, some customers, on top of the technology and the technological monitoring, they also want real guards. So, think of, I don't know, luxury warehouses or jewelry, etc. They might want physical guarding on top of the technology. So it's a highly recurring business, because if you think about it, even during a crisis, you don't want to give up on security, right? You might cut costs elsewhere, but you won't risk your office or factory getting robbed. And these don't tend to be very expensive services. So we like the stickiness of that. We like the cash flow and margins of this business, because this business has almost 30% EBITDA margin, which is very high. And so we like that. And we felt that it was because under the previous owners, other private equity firms, they just really didn't have the buy and build acquisition story in their DNA. The business hadn't been able to acquire as many companies as it could have. So we saw the opportunity to really do two things: help them execute acquisitions, and we like to do that aggressively. We can leverage, again, all the Alvarez & Marsal consultants and their network to get to find companies to buy, as well as our own networks and all the banks and advisors we work with. And then the other was really to evolve their go-to-market commercial strategy. What do I mean by that? Before, the business used to sell, i.e. find new clients, only through agents, third-party agents. But it's hard. When you rely entirely on third parties, you don't really have control of your sales. What we've, back to Stefano's question earlier, what we pushed them to do, and they agreed, was to set up their own sales force, control their sales channel directly, so that you know who you're targeting, you have the right incentives for your people, and you really can push them in the right direction. So we've seen an increase in organic growth through that. We've entered the residential market, which was before was a small part of the business. So I think this has allowed us to target residential customers. So like any of us, if we wanted an alarm, they could do it in their regions. And then acquisitions. So we've started to I think we've sent out, we bought the business, a year and a half ago. We sent out something like 100 offers. We are in exclusivity on about 10. We closed one recently. We have a couple we're hoping to close soon. And really, the rationale for that is that you just buy subscriptions, really, and sometimes you buy access to a certain region. So you will probably know, maybe if you're in a small town, or you're used to living in a home and not an apartment, you'll know some of the local alarm providers. So if you buy one of those, you have access to the region and you have the brand recognition. But really, then you connect those alarms to your central monitoring station, wherever it is, and you don't need multiple monitoring stations. So you have synergies in that. You can use, if you have enough presence in a certain location, you will have you can have density, so that, let's say you're covering the city of Milan. If you have enough customers there, you can use a smaller number of guards to patrol the whole area, right? Because you know that on average, you get, one call, one alarm breach every, let's say, 100 subscribers, once a month, for example. You'll be able to quantify that, and you'll be able to have the right number of people in patrols that you can send when that happens, and you can leverage that. The more you grow its subscribers, the higher you can leverage that. So that's the overall. I see there's a question from Cesare.
He's asking
how do you deal with investment?
How do you deal with investments, if any, that turn out to be bad? Do you have some sort of stop loss after which you prefer to divest, or do you rather lengthen the life in order to possibly recover the region of profit?
So, Cesare, thanks for the question. I think the short answer is yes. You have to admit when you've made a mistake, when things go wrong. And to be honest, those are have been the biggest learnings of my career. Thankfully, there's only been one so far that I was involved with and had a say in that did not go well. But we lost all our money. So that was a huge learning. And then I was involved with another couple that were executed by other colleagues, and then I was asked to manage. In short, I would say you typically, what you do is you allocate as a firm a certain amount of equity to a deal, which is the initial investment plus, call it, depending on the strategy for that deal, is 20%, 30%, etc., on top of whatever you invested at the beginning, to cover acquisitions, to cover losses or capital injections that may be required. And usually you have that. Now, normally you stick to that, but you will sometimes go beyond it if you think it's worth it. I think it varies a lot. It's a combination of, do you really believe you can do something with it? So I'll give you the real life example. In my case, True Religion, which was a denim brand that some of you may know, based in California. We acquired the business when I was at TowerBrook. At the time, it was profitable. It was managed poorly, but it was profitable, and we felt we could turn it, revive it. The issue was we put too much debt, so we put probably 3/4 of the capital structure was debt. Then we made a few mistakes. Actually, it's a case study of what not to do. We put in a CEO that was not competent. We entered at the wrong time of the cycle, because it turns out denim has a cycle. So you go in cycles. Some years, denim and jeans are more popular. In others, they are not. We entered just when it was about to crash. We put too much debt, and we didn't change the CEO fast enough. So, we took a year and a half to change, or 2 years to change the CEO, and we should have changed him after a year. 6 months is too soon, but a year is good enough to get a sense of a manager. And that was a mistake. And so what happened was, the performance declined. We started to have issues with the debt. The covenants were getting tight, and our banks were giving us a hard time, our lenders. So we started putting some equity in to reduce the debt. We bought some of the debt to retire it, but it wasn't enough. And so after investing more capital, we just realized it was going to take another 5 years to restructure the business. We didn't know whether we were going to be able to do it. We weren't willing to put in a lot more equity in, because also, frankly, in that fund we had other businesses that were doing well, and our team wanted to spend time looking at other deals and other portfolio companies. And so we just decided, as hard as it was, to just say, you know what, we have to let this go. We'll negotiate with the banks. They took over the majority of the equity, and we just had to admit the mistake to our investors. So it was really a decision based on opportunity cost, how likely we thought it was going to be for us to save it, and really having tried for a few years.
Excellent. Cesare, clarified your question? Okay, very good. Okay, I think that we have almost exhausted our time. So it has been, I think, an intense session. At the end of this session, the learning objectives that we shared with Alessandro Longo are basically the fact that, first, we have understood how careers in private equity investments have evolved in the past few years. Second, we have understood how the different background of the partners of a private equity company can add value to companies. And third, we have seen a couple of examples that have clearly shown how Alvarez & Marsal Capital approaches company in a different kind of scenario investment. And so I truly believe that the contribution that Mr. Luongo has given us in our course has been incredibly valuable, and definitely bringing a little bit of a ground-based practice of what private equity investors are doing. Lucas, just a very quick question for Alessandro, and then we can close. Lucas is asking, Alessandro, I have two different questions for you. Just to have an idea, what is the proportion of leveraged deals among all deals that you do at AMN Capital? And obviously, London is the most dynamic place for finance in Europe. Do you see other European cities really growing or interesting as private equity hubs?
So, Lucas, I would say in most deals we try and use leverage just to enhance returns, and because we think it makes sense. In some cases, we will do all equity at the beginning and then add leverage later, depending on the risk of that type of deal. I would say we are not aggressive with leverage because we really try and create value from operational improvement. So to do that, we want the flexibility to cut costs, to invest in acquisitions, and so typically we tend to invest lower than the average. I think you'll find that the people who use the most leverage are the large buyout shops like the Bain Capital, the KKRs of the world, because they're paying high prices in very competitive deals, and so it makes a big difference to make, to returns, to add an extra turn of EBITDA of leverage, to take the IRR from 12 to 15%. We're looking for 2.5, 3 times returns, IRRs of 20 to 30%, and it's not really leverage in our view that will drive that. It's really the work we do on the businesses. On London, I think London continues to be the center for Europe. I haven't seen many private equities move. I know that a few have moved people to be able to cover local markets more directly, as well as to take advantage of tax benefits. So, for example, people who had Italians covering Italy, they've moved some people to Milan because it was beneficial for the individual as well from a tax standpoint. But I think the key market continues to be London. Continue to see Milan, Paris, Madrid, Zurich, and Frankfurt, as well as Munich, as very active. So I haven't really seen a change in that in the last few years.
Lucas, fine with you? Okay, so I think that we have exhausted our time, and so I thank very much you guys, and above all, I thank very much Alessandro Luongo for being with us today. We close the session now, and I give you the appointment for my last session for this module next Monday. For the time being, thanks very much, take care, and stay safe. Grazie mille. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure to meet you virtually. I hope we get to meet soon.
Absolutely. Alessandro, I see you very soon at 10:20 for the other class. See you later.
Fantastic.
Ciao. Bye-bye.